Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1115 continues with Vegapunk's earth-shattering revelations with huge implications, and in this breakdown, I'll be talking about all of the fun cameos from characters across the world, how we as fans have been speculating a sunken world for years, and much, much more. Really quick, we continue with the Yamato cover story and get a pretty light one this week. Hiyori and Otoko are packing a lunch for Yamato's journey, and there's not too much to take away from this one, but it does seem like Hiyori is fixing up some salmon, one of Yamato's favorite foods. And so with that covered, let's get into chapter 1115, Pieces of a Continent. We pick back up going around the world and finally get to check in on the people of Wano once again. We of course have Momonosuke and Kinemon, but also Tama and Shinobu we haven't seen since the end of the Wano arc. We briefly saw Momonosuke reacting to the earthquakes earlier in the day, but it wasn't certain that they would be able to tune into Vegapunk's message since Wano doesn't necessarily use transponder snails, instead making do with their smails or smart snails, which are effectively the same thing but with much weaker signals. However, there were a few transponder snails within the walls of Wano. We know Kaido had one on Onigashima, as we saw him use it to speak with Big Mom before the events of the Wano arc, and we also saw X-Drake have one in his possession as well when he used it to speak with Kobe before Act 3. It seems they're tuning into a transponder snail that once belonged to Orochi, further evidenced by its design here resembling the former Shogun's appearance with the pattern on the shell matching Orochi's kimono, the top knot, and the small crown. And while this may feel like a convenience for the people of Wano to be able to learn all about this information, recall that Orochi was shown with a transponder snail back during the Wano arc as well. You can also make out the boss snail in the back that is used to relay messages between smart snails, which may suggest that Vegapunk's message is also making it out to the rest of Wano as well. And we do know that communication between snails and smails is possible, as we saw when Orochi was using his transponder snail to speak with some gifters. Now Kinemon realizes Momonosuke seems to be aware of Joy Boy somehow, and as we know, he did end up reading through Oden's journal, which detailed his travels with Roger. We then cut over to a marine base somewhere on the Grand Line. This is G4, which believe it or not has yet to be mentioned in the series before this chapter. It was implied to exist as we saw G3 at the end of the Marineford arc, and G5 was first mentioned just before the time skip as the base where Smoker requested a transfer to. We saw it in full during the Jinbei cover story. Here, we check in on the fake Straw Hat Pirates, or should I say the fake Kid Pirates, who we last saw at the end of the Return to Sabaody arc. Here we have the fake Straw Hat Luffy, Damalo Black, who now seems to be cosplaying as Eustace Kid. To the right is fake Frankie, whose real name is Turk, and he is dressed as Wire. To the left is a fake Zoro, real name Manjaro, dressed as Heat, and all the way to the side is Drip, who was the fake Sanji and is now imitating Killer, albeit very poorly by simply drawing the mask design over his head and face. The rest of the fake Straw Hat crew doesn't seem to be around, and it's unknown if they're just out of the shot or no longer with the team. Coco, who's the fake Robin and the fake Chopper Stray Fox, was captured by the world government agents and never heard or seen from again. We saw fake Nami and fake Usopp, whose real names are Chocolat and Mount Bletton, with the rest of the group when Caribou was dealing with them in the aftermath. Mount Bletton tried saving Drip from Caribou's suffocating swamp powers, but he ended up getting beaten with shovels by Caribou's crew. We did learn that a few of the fake Straw Hats ended up escaping the Marines, so I suppose we're to assume that the only ones that ended up captured were the ones we see here. But if that's the case, how and why are they posing as kid pirates in a prison? It seems to me that they may have somehow escaped after being captured by Sentomaru and the Marines and chose to impersonate a new gang of pirates before being captured once again. Now, given that Damalo Black's crew capitalized on the Straw Hat Pirates' absence during the 2-year time skip, it seems probable that they started impersonating the Kid Pirates after that crew seemingly disbanded over a month or two ago when Kaido appeared before Kid, Apu, and Hawkins and captured Kid after he refused to join Kaido's forces. Of note, the Kid Pirates were defeated by Shanks just yesterday, so it seems unlikely that Damalo's gang would learn about that quickly enough to start impersonating them because of that. We also then check in on Zou, where we find the new ruler of the Mokomo Dukedom, Carrot, alongside Wanda, the 3 Musketeers Shishilian, Consulat, and Giovanni, and Yomo. While transponder snails were not used on Zou, Frankie did end up making them before leaving the island, which has now allowed the Minx to tune into Vegapunk's broadcast here. Carrot is amazed at the truth of the world, as she has always been curious about how vast the ocean really is. We then get a wild appearance from Foxy, who has grown some facial hair over the time skip, and his crew, well, what's left of it. Alongside him is of course Hamburg and Porsche, who appear to be rowing a small sailboat. If you recall, the last we left this crew was when the Straw Hat Pirates had defeated them in a Davy back fight. Luffy had taken their Jolly Roger and drawn them a new one so that they could continue sailing as a pirate crew, but here we see them without our Jolly Roger at all. This, along with their lack of a crew and ship, makes me think they started losing more and more Davy back fights after their encounter with the Straw Hat Pirates, tarnishing their 920 victory streak and leaving them with a shell of their crew. Foxy questions Vegapunk's intelligence here, which reminded me a bit of how he was boasting about his slowpoke photons that were undiscovered by science. Now, I've longed to check back in on Foxy, but his inclusion here may have been more than just a fun cameo. Recall that the Davy Back fight is actually named after the legend of Davy Jones, who was said to be a cursed pirate that now lives on the seafloor and keeps everything that is sunk to him. This bit of mythology feels even more interesting now with the context of the world sinking. We then briefly check in on Shimotsky Village, a place that we last saw during the last decks of the world cover story, where Koshiro was watching over the students' training before getting the reaction of the Revolutionary Army to this message. And present, of course, are Dragon, Ivankov, Sabo, as well as Bello Betty, Morley, Koala, and Gambo. We then revisit Koko Village for the first time since the decks of the world cover story during the Fishman Island arc, and see that the villagers tuned in here as well. Mayor Genzo, Dr. Neko, and Chabo are up front, but Nojiko doesn't seem to care that much and is more concerned about her tangerines. And I personally love this inclusion, as it once again reinforces the idea that this sort of information is not necessarily pressing for the average citizen of the world who is just trying to survive. The world sinking is irrelevant if they can't make enough money to live to see it anyways. Also, the transponder snail here looks to have a coconut tree inspired design, since after all the name of the village comes from the word for coconut. After just having seen it in the last chapter, we revisit Mocktown once again to see them continuing to ridicule Vegapunk's message. We even have some of the same guys making an appearance, but there is a new familiar face in the mix here who is paying attention as we get what looks to be the return of Roshio the Executioner. This was the pirate captain whom Bellamy accused of cheating before throwing him out of a window. Now, this character was long thought to have been dead, given how the people of Mocktown spoke about his fight against Bellamy, but it turns out they were merely just exaggerating, and Roshio has seemingly been spending his days since then here. We then briefly see that the Sakura Kingdom is tuned in as well, in what looks to be the town of Bighorn, where Dalton lived. He was last seen at the Reverie alongside Kureha, who expresses some excitement at this news. Kureha has always been a very interesting character, being one of the oldest humans we know of to date, leading some to speculate that she knows a lot more about the world's history than she lets on. From here, we also get to see some former Baroque Works members over on an as of yet unnamed island. We last saw these folks during Miss Golden Week's cover story, where they ended up opening the new Spider's Cafe. Here we see Miss Golden Week herself, whose real name is Marianne, Drophy, formerly known as Miss Merry Christmas, and as well as what looks to be Makita, formerly Miss Valentine. Someone in the crowd points out how the mountain is approximately 200 meters tall to express the scale of what Vegapunk is saying. We actually saw this mountain back during the cover story as well. And one fun little detail here is that Marianne's hat is very reminiscent of Vegapunk's head, both being the top half of an apple. I doubt there's very much significance here, but with Oda, I guess you never know. And our final locations once again includes Water 7, this time from the perspective of a group of shipwrights and citizens. Oda is really emphasizing Water 7's importance here, as he keeps showing this island in these chapters, which only makes sense given that they've been experiencing a similar problem over the centuries. I also love how the screen is propped up by a few ship masts. And over on the World Economic Journal's aircraft, Borgens exclaims, prompting Vivi to shush him as she's deeply interested in this message. Throughout this chapter, we also get a bit more of the abilities of the Five Elders. When the group first arrived on the island, we noticed large black bolts of lightning associated with their summoning, cluing us into their potential for Haki in some form. Since then, we've seen a few of them make use of observation Haki to sense the transponder snails in the lab, and we also saw Nushiro coat his blade with armament Haki when cutting through the Pacifista. Orkuri was the first one to exhibit use of Conqueror's Haki, as seen with the tremendous roar a few chapters ago, but here, we see that Marcus Mars and Jay Garcia's Saturn also have it as well, as we see them knocking out transponder snails left and right when walking through the lab. At this point, it wouldn't be surprising if all 5 of them had access to Conquerors. Jupiter is the only one who has not displayed any explicit use of Haki, but then again, he's also the one who we've seen into action the least, so I expect great things from him in the future. Over at the northeastern coast, Bonnie in her giant-like form goes in for a kick against Nosturo as he knocks away Sanji and Oimo. He tries to take Bonnie's head off, but only ends up slicing the figurehead of the giant pirate's ship as Frankie comes in to save her. And Bonnie mentions how she can't keep up this form for a prolonged amount of time, which is pretty consistent with every other instance that we've seen her use this technique, even when used on others such as Luffy and Chopper both being reverted back to their original states within a few moments. Now, with Vegapunk's message divulging more and more information, Nushiro decides to take matters into his own hands and leaps into the air. We see him seemingly utilize his observation Haki to try and pinpoint the transponder snails, but appears to be unable to due to the sheer number of living beings on the Labo phase. As such, he simply ends up cutting the Labo phase in two, bisecting it from the middle of the basement floor of the lab. This is of course very reminiscent of Law's ability to cut a portion of Punk Hazard, but whereas that was facilitated with his op fruit abilities, this here is pure swordsmanship from Nishijuro. By cutting the island cloud in half, he seems to have been able to displace the CP agents and Seraphim that were in the basement lab, causing them to crash down to the middle of the Fabio phase. Now I've been wondering how the Seraphim would come back into play, thinking perhaps York may have gone to fetch them, but it seems now that they'll be readily available for the Elders to command. They should survive the fall given their durability and their impermeable bubbles that they're trapped in, but I do wonder what will become of the Cypher Ball agents. They had expressed gratitude to the Straw Hats for saving their lives, but now they're falling to their deaths by the hands of the Elders. We do get a brief panel of some Marines expressing the need to rescue them, which may further put them at odds with the Elders, as Kizaru and Saturn had ordered the Marines to evacuate the island earlier. Plus, the Elders don't really care about the lives of these soldiers anyways. I also love how much characterization we get from Nishijuro, with him referring to the lives of the agents as bio-responses, almost as if he doesn't acknowledge life as anything more than a biological signal. Now, I am a little confused on the mechanics of how the Seraphim and Cypher Pole are falling downwards here. It looks like they were in the bottom portion of the island cloud since they were in the basement, so simply cutting the cloud in two like this shouldn't force them downwards. Perhaps it's implied that the bottom half of the island is tilted enough to where they'd be falling out, but I guess we'll have to wait for this to be adapted in the anime just to be sure. It's also a little unclear if Nishijuro's intent with this was to take out transponder snails or to simply remove any unnecessary noise that was preventing them from sensing snails more accurately. Given how intentional and precise this slash was, it seems to me the latter, especially since the Elder's goals included preserving certain parts of the Labo phase. The island cloud still seems stable enough by the end of this chapter, but I suppose we'll see how the Straw Hats up there react. Speaking of, it does seem Zoro and Jinbei are not quite near the rest of the group just yet, and that Marine ships have started surrounding the giant ship, making it more difficult for their escape. Edison tells Stussy to take down the Frontier Dome and escape with her life, assuring her that the Straw Hats will find a way to make it out of the situation. However, Stussy starts getting a bit existential here, as she seemed pretty set on dying for the sake of the Straw Hats. Edison telling her to continue on has made her a bit anxious, as she feels she no longer has any purpose to direct her in her life, now that her role as Vegapunk's government spy is no longer needed. This sort of existential dread seems to have been haunting her for years, as we first saw her make mention of it during Kuma's flashback. Vegapunk had always been the one to validate her existence as an autonomous human being, even if she was made as a clone. I really don't know where Oda will go with this plot thread here, as there's still quite a lot of mystery surrounding her between her devil fruit powers and the history of Mads. After this chapter, I have hopes that she won't feel the need to actually sacrifice herself, and maybe is able to choose a life of her own. Also of note, Kaku does seem somewhat saddened upon hearing Stussy here. Perhaps he himself can relate to her to some extent with this feeling of feeling useless or abandoned. I'm excited to see what becomes of these two, especially with Saturn and Mars making their way through the lab detecting life forms. And so, with all this said, let's talk about Vegapunk's message. There are a couple big takeaways from Vegapunk's revelations in this chapter, and we'll go through them one by one. But first, Vegapunk reiterates that he does not have the complete picture and mentions he only had drawn these conclusions from a couple of poneglyphs. Recall that there exists roughly 30 poneglyphs in the world, with 4 of them detailing the location of Laugh-Tale, known as road poneglyphs, and 9 of them detailing the true history of the world, known as real poneglyphs in the English translation. Vegapunk talks about a grand war during the Void Century with an alliance of the 20 kings who would go on to form the world government against Joy Boy and his people, presumably the ancient kingdom that Clover first spoke of during the flashback to the Ohara incident. We as readers first learned about this conflict back then, but it wasn't until earlier in this arc that it was first described as an explicit war when the Straw Hats learned about it themselves. It continues that he is not necessarily aware of what caused the war, and as such, once again chooses not to judge either side, before revealing that what made the Ancient Kingdom so advanced, as he said in the previous chapters, was their technological prowess. This was first hinted at during the Ohara flashback when Clover mentioned the Ancient Kingdom's enormous power. We, along with the Straw Hats, ended up learning that this was with respect to their scientific advancements earlier in this arc with that conversation with Shaka. As a real quick sidebar, it's becoming a lot more evident why Shaka was so comfortable divulging this information to the Straw Hats back then toward the start of this arc, since he suspected his impending demise and knew this knowledge would be soon told to the world at large anyways. Also, this appears to be our first real depiction of Joy Boy here against the 20 Kings. His form is of course pretty much identical to how Luffy looks in Gear 5th. The 20 Kings that he's up against are mostly just vague silhouettes, but you do see their swords, calling back to the swords that are found around the empty throne. Of note, there is one who seems to have a particularly round feature in front of their face, perhaps a nose. This could contribute to the wild theories that Buggy is also the descendant of a celestial dragon, but we'll have to see. Now, it's this highly advanced technology that would be the main issue for the world when Joy Boy was defeated by the end of the Void Century. It's unclear what this means exactly for Joy Boy's age. In the previous chapter, Vegapunk had said he was born 900 years ago, though that doesn't necessarily need to be an exact specification of his birth year. Of course, there's always the speculation that Joy Boy had been a giant since their lifespans are triple that of a human's, but in Volume 56, Oda revealed that a normal human's lifespan could reach up to 140 years old, so we still don't have too much to go off on just yet. Then, Vegapunk goes into the difficulties of living in a world divided by ocean, which the people of the world have taken for granted as a reality of their life. However, it turns out the world was not always like this. The world once featured several continental masses of land that are now submerged beneath the ocean due to an unnatural 200-meter rise in sea level during the Void Century. Now, this is huge news, as it confirms some theories that we as fans have speculated for over a decade at this point. Back then, it was mostly informed conjecture, just given the state of the world and various tropes in these stories of worlds full of ocean and lost kingdoms, but over time, more and more pieces of evidence started coming into play. Although I wasn't making videos during those olden times, I spoke about this possibility on this channel as far back as when Chapter 1089 first came out. All in all, we're showing a look at various places around the world that have suffered from the rising sea level in the past, are currently suffering from it, or will in the future. I'm super interested in the various places across the world that are submerged because it hints at the possibility of the sea level gradually rising over time and in turn causing many civilizations to be lost or forced to adapt. We have some sort of evidence for this with Impelled Down, as the prison may have been built at a time when the sea level was not as high as it currently is. Counterpoint, Impelled Down could have just been built downward somehow. It would be difficult to imagine, but crazier things have happened in the series. However, there is evidence in the source material for civilizations that got lost in the sea. In Jinbei's cover story, somewhere between G5, a marine base in the New World by the Red Line, and Whole Cake Island, there exists a port town, and off the coast underwater of this port town are the ruins of an older civilization that housed the poneglyph. In present day, this civilization is occupied by various sea beasts who use it as their home, but its existence implies that there was once no water here. So not only did the sea level rise, but it may have not been here at all, which would also explain how Impelled Down was built. And just in the last breakdown, we discussed the possibility of a supercontinent that connected the various parts of the world together before being sunk into the ocean, leaving behind disparate islands. It turns out the world of One Piece is not unlike the state of Long Ring Longland, where the only highest parts of the landmass are visible when the water level rises. All of this together could work very well toward the theory that the One Piece is literally a world that is one single piece, one interconnected continent. He concludes that this drastic rise in sea level could not be natural, as if it were, there would have been a clear ecological signs preceding it to suggest whatever progression became of the oceans. As such, this must have been the work of something man-made, ancient weapons that were able to destroy the world that they once knew. And so, when he noticed the sea level a few days ago, he suspected that whatever happened to sink the world during the Void Century must be happening again. And so, he lands on the notion that the ancient weapons are still out there and that the war from the Void Century never ended, but rather is still going on to this day. So, if the weapon that destroyed Lelouch was indeed responsible for the earthquakes that caused the sea levels to rise, then it would seem, by order of elimination, that the world government has possession of Uranus, since Shirahoshi was said to be Poseidon and Pluton is hidden beneath Wano. This realization was first hinted at earlier in this arc when Ivankov suggested that thing above Lelouch to have been an ancient weapon, that we know had not been used until now because the world government lacked the means to fuel it before receiving some of the mother flame from York. All in all, while a lot of the stuff in this chapter were things we as fans may have already known or at the very least speculated, it's always good to get confirmation on these theories, and it's even better for the world at large to be aware of the information that we as readers have had for quite a while. Now, some people may recognize some inconsistencies with this information, namely with the fishmen, who would be able to simply observe these sunken civilizations. In fact, that's exactly what happened in Jinbei's cover story when he came across sunken ruins that in the present day were being inhabited by sea beasts. It could very well be the case that the world that once existed beneath these waters has now been overtaken by the life of the ocean, making it seem to a casual observer that these structures belong to them. We saw a potential example of this as far back as Hachi's cover story with the Goldfish Kingdom. At the time, we just thought this was a fun, fantastical part of this world, but with this new context, it makes us look at this in a different light. And speaking of, that's probably another reason why most people would not be able to observe the sunken civilizations, since after a certain point, light does not extend to the depths of the oceans. We've seen this throughout the series, such as both instances when the Straw Hats try to descend down upon Fishman Island. In fact, even Fishman Island itself is shrouded in darkness and is only able to have light thanks to the sunlight tree Eve. and honestly, this may even be part of why fishermen were discriminated against for so long and were forced to live below the surface. Allowing them to roam the seas freely and mingle with humans above the surface would have made it easier for the people of the world to realize just what exactly was down in the ocean. There are a lot of wild implications from these reveals in these chapters, and I'd love to hear what you all think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, be sure to like and subscribe so you can get my videos as soon as they come out. Thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.